Thanks, and welcome everybody. Thanks again for attending today's HIMSS Industry Solutions webinar, Protect Your Data and Share It Too, sponsored by PHEMI. As we all know, healthcare organizations are driving to obtain insights from their data to control rising costs, improve quality of care, and drive medical research as well as innovation. As these organizations work to break down information silos and consolidate data for analytics, they're faced with the data dilemma. How can we gather and share our information and, at the same time, protect patients' privacy? In this webinar, you'll learn how organizations can use data for its desired effects, while at the same time protecting that personal information contained therein. Our speakers today are Dr. Ann Cavoukian, Executive Director of Privacy and Big Data Institute at Ryerson University, and Dr. Paul Terry, who's President and CEO of PHEMI. With that, I'd now like to hand it over to you, Dr. Cavoukian, to begin our presentation.
Thank you very much, and I'm just delighted to be here and have a chance to speak to you all. I want to just I always start with the question of what is privacy, because there's a lot of confusion in my mind as to what people normally associate with this. So bear with me. Whenever I have a captive audience, I just like to work through this. Here's what privacy is not. Privacy does not equal secrecy. It's not about having something to hide. I'm sure you've all heard people say, well, if you have nothing to hide, what's the big deal? You have nothing to fear. That's utter nonsense, because that does not describe a free and democratic society. I always say that statement was probably the motto of the Stasi police in the Third Reich. If you have law-abiding citizens, they are free to do what they want with their personal information. So privacy, more properly, is all about control. It's about personal control on the part of an individual to make decisions relating to the uses of their personal information, especially their health information. Freedom of choice is critical so that the individual can freely share what they choose to or refrain from doing so. The Germans have a wonderful term for this called informational self-determination. A big term, simple concept, that it should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information. This is absolutely critical because it's only the individual who knows the context associated with the information. Privacy is highly contextual, and if you're not in that person's position, you will not know their wishes as to how they want to use information. And I often use myself as an example for this because I was a privacy commissioner for many years, 17 years, and about 12 years ago, we introduced a law in Ontario called HIPAA, the Health Information Protection Act. And it's amazing, the Personal Health Information Act. You have HIPAA, we have PHIPAA. And the thing about PHIPAA was it has just enormous protections in it, but it was highly contextual, and it really got to the needs of the individual. So it respected privacy while also, of course, ensuring that health services could be delivered in the utmost way. Now, I'm going to talk to you today about privacy by design. And I call it the decade of privacy by design because 2010, privacy commissioners have an annual conference once a year, usually in Europe, an international conference. In 2010, it was in Jerusalem, and privacy by design was unanimously passed as an international standard. But before I go into that, let me ask you first, if I may, how many of you have heard of privacy by design? So to go to the next, I think of that, yes, here it is. How familiar are you with privacy by design, which is all about the need to embed privacy proactively into design in order to reduce, identify the risks and mitigate the risks by addressing it proactively? I'm just going to wait a few seconds to give you a chance to respond. happen now? Oh, good, good. Who have responded? So we're just going to wait a few more seconds for just a few more people to respond, and then we'll move on. Okay, so here are the results that we found. The majority, slightly over half, are at least somewhat familiar, and I'm surprised, 22% are very familiar. I'm delighted to see that. I was expecting more to be unfamiliar with this. So I'm delighted that over half of you are somewhat or very familiar with privacy by design. You're going to hear even more. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I hope that you will learn some material that you'll be able to use. So let me just move on. As I mentioned, in 2010 at the International Privacy Commissioners and Data Protection Authorities Conference, I advanced a resolution, as we do at the end of our conference, is a half-day closed session, and we advanced resolutions, and I advanced one on privacy by design that year. And what amazed me was that it was unanimously passed by all of the commissioners at the conference. And the reason that surprised me is, generally speaking, most of the commissioners are lawyers who love to look at, Section 23, Sub 2, Part A, and drill down and apply the law to the fact situation. The problem was, increasingly, with this world of ubiquitous computing and online connectivity and social media and connected devices, the majority of the privacy harms were no longer coming to our attention as commissioners. They were just, I always use the tip of the iceberg analogy, they were escaping, for the most part, our detection because they were just so widespread. So the majority of breaches were now remaining largely unknown, unchallenged, unregulated. And that, of course, was completely unacceptable to the commissioners present. So they kindly adopted my resolution that privacy by design will become the international standard for privacy and data protection. And it has been, I can report back to you that the success has been amazing. In the last 5 years, it's been translated into 37 languages. So it has a real global presence all around the world, and it's being followed regularly. It's really quite remarkable, both in the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Japan is a big fan, and in the United States. The Federal Trade Commission, I'll be talking about that in a moment, how the Federal Trade Commission had used it as one of its pillars of privacy protection. Now, one of the essentials of privacy by design is asking you to reject zero-sum models. Zero-sum is an either-or proposition. You can either have privacy or data analytics, privacy or research, privacy or security. It's a versus, privacy versus another interest. And I can tell you, in my world, it's never privacy that wins in that equation. And nor should it. I'm not trying to suggest that privacy should be more important than healthcare services, but it should be equally important. So I want you to reject zero-sum models and in its place substitute what is called positive sum. All positive sum means is win-win. You can change the paradigm. You can create a win-win scenario by abandoning the either-or model and substituting and. What I've learned, and I've spoken to so many technology experts, engineers, software designers, they told me that this either-or proposition is essentially a false dichotomy. It involves unnecessary trade-offs, which you do not have to accept. Just get rid of it. And that's what I'm asking you to do today. Now, I'm going to review very quickly the 7 foundational principles of privacy by design, and these form the foundation, literally, of whatever program, privacy program, you want to implement at your company or government department. It doesn't matter. But it forms the base of it, and the actual program can look 100 different ways, as long as this forms the base. It's all about being proactive. We want to prevent the privacy harms from arising. Think of a medical model of prevention. Can you imagine going to your doctor, and he sends you for some tests, and he says, yeah, I see you've got some cancer developing. We'll just see how it grows, and if it gets worse, we'll offer you some chemo after the fact. I mean, what an unthinkable proposition. I want it to be equally unthinkable that you would allow privacy harms to arise when you have an opportunity to get rid of them from the outset. So think of a model of prevention, not a system of redress after the fact, but one of preventing the harm from arising. Privacy as the default setting is probably the hardest principle in that it basically asks you to automatically embed privacy measures into your IT programs, into your business practices, the programs you're offering, so that it is an essential component of what you're offering. You're not leaving it to the user, either a consumer or a citizen, to go through your privacy policy, search for the opt-out box so that says, yes, I want privacy. No, we know realistically no one reads the privacy policies. No one reads the terms of service. We need a much better solution. So the solution, if you offer privacy as the default setting, it means you can offer privacy assurance from the get-go to all of your customers, to your citizens, to whoever you're serving. And believe me, they will thank you for this. This builds enormous loyalty and trust. And ladies and gentlemen, in this day and age, in the post-Edward Snowden world, public distrust is at an all-time high. Consumer confidence is at an all-time low. You build in privacy automatically into what you're offering, and all of that changes. Embedded in design is obvious. I talk to so many tech people, and they say, of course, we can put it into the data architecture. We want to bake it in. That's what I want you to do. I want you to make it an essential component of what you're doing. I've talked about full functionality. The positive sum is absolutely, I can tell you from my experience, positive sum opens so many doors because it then allows you to engage in a dialogue that is not exclusionary. It includes whoever you're talking with because you're having multiple interests served at the same time. Let me speak about security for a moment. While the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, if you don't have strong security end-to-end with full lifecycle protection from the time of the data collection through the data use through to the secure destruction of the data, you're not going to have good privacy. Privacy is predicated on a base of very strong security, especially in this day and age with cybersecurity attacks rampant. Visibility and transparency, this is so important because I would always like to remind everyone, be there in the private or public sector, the data you collect from your customers or your citizens, that's not your data. You may have custody and control over that data, but you don't own the data. The data belong to the data subject. So you have to tell them, what are you going to do with the information? What do you intend to do? Are you going to use it? Then you need to restrict your use of that information to that purpose that you've identified to the data subject unless they consent to additional secondary uses. And respect for user privacy is just critical. When you keep it user-centric, everything flows from that because the user is part of what you're doing. It builds trust. Everything grows. Now, let me just move on. I want to just make it clear to you that this is not an academic construct or a theoretical formulation. It's real. It's on the ground. When I was commissioner, if it didn't work on the ground at that time, it had very limited value because technology was advancing at such a rapid pace. This paper was done at the end of 2012. We wrote papers. All of these were separate papers that we wrote with the major companies in the world: Microsoft, IBM, Intel, HP, Oracle. I'm leaving out a bunch, but we partnered with each of these leading companies to show how you could operationalize privacy by design in all of these areas. We did a really neat one with Intel involving healthcare in the home, where you could have elderly patients remaining at home for a longer period of time, even if they lived alone, as long as you had some additional tools, like putting sensors on their beds so that in the middle of the night, for example, if someone got up to go to the restroom, but they didn't return within a predetermined period of time, the sensor would go off and would wirelessly, of course, send out a message, send help. But all of this was done on the highest privacy protection methods that you could imagine. Everything was encrypted, the wireless communications. Privacy by design was embedded throughout the entire system. So this just gives you some idea of how we can do this. And what I urge you to do in your own respective areas is don't wait. Develop best practices now in your own areas. Work with PHEMI if you have data that they can protect in terms of de-identification and all of the amazing techniques that they have, which will enable you to maximize the utility of the data, use the data for research purposes and other purposes, but ensure that the data are strongly protected from the outset. That's what's critical. And if you do that, then perhaps you may be a candidate for Privacy by Design certification. I'm now offering that. We just started. We're partnering with Deloitte. Deloitte is the arm who will actually go out and look under the hood, so to speak, to ensure that they will do the attestation audit work that needs to be done to ensure that your claim of following Privacy by Design is in fact real, and then we will be in a position to certify you so that you can show this on your website, on all your materials. Use it as a competitive advantage because people love it, and they will just reward you again and again with their loyalty and their repeat business. And you might say, well, okay, Privacy by Design makes sense, but what's it going to cost me? I'm sure it costs a lot. Let me assure you that the cost of doing Privacy by Design is a fraction of what costs you will invariably incur if you don't do Privacy by Design. I can virtually guarantee you'll have some kind of data breach or privacy infraction. And I should mention that it's no longer lawsuits, they're class action lawsuits in response to these data breaches. But even worse is the damage to your brand, the damage to your reputation can be just so staggering that you may not be able to recover from it. The loss also of consumer confidence and trust on the part of the public, this can just tank your operations completely after a privacy infraction. So think about doing this. And I mentioned earlier that this is being done worldwide. I'm not kidding. And Japan was one of the first early adopters of Privacy by Design. And just before I left my term as commissioner, I got a letter from the Japanese Information Processing Development Center telling me how strongly they consider Privacy by Design to be at their operations and how they embrace the principle of positive sum instead of zero sum. And I thought, this is so cool. If the Japanese can somehow grasp the term positive sum, then we should be able to handle this. So just a chuckle there. Now let me turn to the Internet of Things just for a moment and talk about wearable devices and sensors. You know, remote healthcare monitoring and wearables have enormous benefits, but they can also have significant privacy risks unless you've embedded privacy into the process. The devices are such that for a number of people, obtaining consent before using the devices seems to be a very difficult exercise. I still can't figure out why, but that is the way it is. And the concern might be that people might think that with an isolated device, it's not a big deal having some personal information revealed because it's only one pinpoint. But what they don't realize is that once you aggregate this with other pieces of the puzzle, it can reveal a very detailed profile of your activities and personal details associated with your situation. And this may land in the hands of unauthorized third parties. These are the kind of things that are to be avoided at all costs in terms of remote healthcare monitoring. A short while ago in the European Union, there's this, it's called the Article 29 Working Party. What they do is they look at privacy and technology-related issues. And they looked at the Internet of Things and they said, bottom line, make privacy the default setting. Recall that that's number 2, second foundational principle. And they said, follow Privacy by Design. As I mentioned, Privacy by Design is quite big in Europe and lots of other countries. But it gives you an idea that people are very concerned about this, that the notion of an individual's, as I mentioned, the term self-determination over their own data is absolutely critical and has to be somehow portrayed and embedded in your privacy policies. Another position that was put out by the privacy commissioners at their last conference last year in Mauritius, they were talking about the value of the Internet of Things, and they were very concerned about connectivity being ubiquitous. And I loved it. They made a resolution, and they said privacy by design should be the key selling point of innovative technologies. And the reason I love that is it puts it in a positive light. I always say if you follow privacy by design, don't keep it to yourself. Shout it from the rooftops, because it will attract a lot of attention and confidence on the part of customers, on the part of citizens. Very, very important to do this. And one of the big concerns, of course, is that if you don't do this, your activities are going to be traceable. So this, I have to show you this slide from Symantec. Symantec did a survey earlier in the year, and they were concerned about how many wireless wearable products can actually be tracked. Even I was surprised at this. All of them. All of the hardware-based devices, wireless devices that they looked at, were 100% trackable. I mean, really? That just blew me away. I knew the number would be high. I just didn't think it would be that high. And also, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has expressed significant concerns over wearable devices, wireless wearable devices, associated with health information. And they did a study, and they found that data stored in mobile health apps, first of all, were not covered by HIPAA. And they also found, they looked at 12 mobile health and fitness apps, and they found that they were sharing information, user information, with 76 different parties. I mean, this is just staggering. And so the FTC wants to ensure that developers have the necessary safeguards to protect personal health information. And I'm just wondering, I don't have the slide here unless it's coming up later. No, I think I left out a slide. I can include at another time the position of the FTC on privacy by design. It was the first of 3 best practices that the FTC put out several years ago, and under John Leibowitz, the former chair of the FTC, and the current chairwoman of the FTC, Edith Ramirez, I have a quote where she says, "We refer to privacy by design, we value it, and refer to it as one of the key pillars of our privacy framework." I can make that available to you. So let me move on. I don't have too much time left. Now, I have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to jump ahead. Forgive me. I wasn't sure how many people would be on this call, would be from Ontario and from Canada. I understand that quite a few of you are from the States, so I'm not going to bore you with PHIPAA, which is Ontario statute, but I will tell you one thing. PHIPAA is the gold standard. Several years ago in the U.S., the Institute of Medicine looked around the world for one health information privacy law, a statute that they could use to form the basis of the revisions they were contemplating with the U.S. HIPAA. The only existing statute they pointed to was Ontario's PHIPAA. It is excellent. So if we have time, we can go into a description of why it's so great. But I'm going to just jump ahead right now because I want to talk to you about data minimization, which is really, really important, and the de-identification of data. Now, as you know, personal health information is the most sensitive type of information out there. It is absolutely essential that you engage in data minimization. What is data minimization? It means once you make use of the data for its health-related purposes, for the purposes for which it was intended, that you then strip the data of personal identifiers associated with it so that you can use it for a variety of research purposes and data analytics without the concern of having the personal identifiers linked to the data and then subject to a data breach or other privacy infraction. It's very, very important that you engage in this right away. And there are many methods of doing this. I did a paper with Professor Khaled El-Imam at the University of Ottawa a number of years ago to try to dispel some of the myths associated with the de-identification. And so we always urge people, we've done several papers. I've done a paper in the States, of course, with ITIF. There are many, many groups who know the value of de-identifying data properly. And if you de-identify data properly, as Information Technology and Innovation Foundation indicated, then you can innovate and do much more with the data. So I'm just going to move quickly. And I just want to make this point that you may also have read a number of articles saying, well, it's really easy to re-identify data, so why bother? If you scrub those studies and really scratch the surface, what you'll find is that the studies they're talking about, the data were very poorly de-identified at the outset. If you de-identify data poorly at the beginning, of course you're going to be able to re-identify. It's just like if you've got a crappy lock on a door, people are going to be able to break in very easily. So you get an industrial strength lock. You ramp it up. Same with any kind of technique. And if you do that, you can minimize the risk of re-identification dramatically. And then people say, well, but you can never eliminate all risk. And I say, yeah, of course you can't. What are we talking about? I call this the myth of zero risk. And quite simply, what I mean by that is there is nowhere in the world where there is zero risk of anything. You walk out on the street, you might be hit by a car. You go out onto the street when it's raining and there's lightning, it's the remote chance of being hit by lightning, but the odds are so low that you are quite happy to accept that risk. So I'm going to just move forward, and I think I've tried to make the case that de-identification is absolutely critical, and it will enable you to innovate and use the data for a variety of other purposes. And we have a number of papers on this, and you'll see this. What I want to jump ahead to now is what's happening with respect to safe harbor for those of you who are in the States. As you may know, just 2 weeks ago, on October the 6th, the European Union Court of Justice invalidated the U.S. Safe Harbor Agreement with the EU. I mean, this was huge because, as you can imagine, there's about 4,000 companies in the U.S. that use Safe Harbor, which enables them to exchange information with residents in the European Union, and the data can go back and forth, etc. Now, they're all rushing to find other tools because that is no longer sufficient. So first of all, I just wanted you to know that. The next thing I want to tell you is that what you'll be seeing at the end of the year or early next year, there's a draft EU General Data Protection Regulation that's been in the works for the last couple of years. People are saying that it'll probably be passed by the end of this year or possibly early next year. For the first time ever, the language of privacy by design, the actual words, data protection by design, and privacy as the default, that's why it's so important, the actual words actually appear in a statute. This is the first time ever. And this regulation will be replacing the 28 different privacy laws in the 28 member countries of the EU. So this is huge. If you're doing privacy by design now, you will be in such a good position to do any kind of business with the EU because they love privacy by design, it seems, and they're now putting it into their new law. So you will be ahead of the game, if you will. And here I had to extract this quote from an article in Information Age where they were talking about privacy by design in the context of the General Data Protection Regulation, and I couldn't resist. They said it's not too much of a stretch to say that if you implement privacy by design, you've mastered the General Data Protection Regulation. I thought that was very cool. So on that note, let me end, ladies and gentlemen, and just ask you to consider proactively protecting privacy, identifying the risks, and then mitigating them because you've addressed the harms from the beginning, and you can thereby avoid the data breaches and the privacy infractions. The cost is a fraction of the costs you will definitely entail once you have a data breach or privacy infraction. And all you have to do is start by abandoning zero-sum thinking. It's not one interest versus another. It's how do you do both. And I'm going to turn it over now. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Paul Terry, the CEO of PHEMI, for the next section of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. So my section here. So my name is Paul Terry. I'm the CEO of PHEMI. I'm also a board member on hospital conglomerate there that actually looks after several million patients. So my issue is, let's move on to the next slide. Slide 48. This is the problem that we see in our hospitals. So when I joined the board of a hospital, we have 1,000 databases or more in everyday use, holding all sorts of data. The question begged, how do we control this data? How do we share it? And how do we protect it? And so we set out in PHEMI to use any technology we cared to use to actually try to solve this data dilemma. The technologies we chose were big data based on privacy by design. So let me ask a question of the audience before I go too much further. How do I share data for research and analysis without compromising privacy, security, and governance? So a question for the audience there is, what do you think your biggest privacy challenge is around the data? Is it the ability to share the data, the fear of data breaches, the need to comply with regulations, or the need to comply with internal governance policies? What do you think? I'll just wait 2 or 3 seconds here, 20 seconds to figure that out. Okay. So this is what you guys are thinking here. Fear of data breaches constitutes the biggest threat. The ability to share data and the need to comply with regulations being number 2 and number 3. So let me go into how do you do this? How do you design a system that protects, controls information, protects privacy, stops data breaches, complies with regulations, and allows you to share the data? To do this, I'm going to draw an analogy with zero trust. Zero trust is a technology that's well understood in the world of networking. In the world of networking, on slide number 53 here, what we normally do is we have a perimeter around some sort of trust network. So inside that network, it might be your enterprise. We trust people. Outside, we don't trust people. And often we put a firewall between that trust and that no trust network to stop the bad guys getting in. What's happened over the recent 5 years is that zero trust networking has become all the rage. And the idea there is that you don't have a firewall to protect your network. You have a firewall inside your network that's protecting every individual connection from every server to every client. And the idea in zero trust networking is you never trust a connection that's required. You always verify it. So you look at the connection, you say, is this connection valid? If it is, I'll allow it to happen. If it's not, I won't. So from that perspective, what you've actually done is taken a firewall, which is kind of a crude device, put it inside of a network and made it essentially a part of all your network. So even people inside the organization are not necessarily trusted. Their connection is trusted. Now imagine that zero trust network moving towards data, which is what we essentially have done. So imagine that there's a firewall on every single piece of information that you have in your organization. There can be billions of pieces of information, from healthcare records to x-rays to MRIs through to genomic sequences, and every single one of them is mapped and identified such that we always check whether the person or machine allowed to see this information is in fact allowed to do it for billions of items. This is the notion of zero trust data, bringing the protection from the networking layer actually into the data layer. So I'm going to start with an example, and then I'm going to show you how we do it. So how do we implement zero trust data in healthcare? So the example I'm going to show is a company called Molecular U. And Molecular U is a BC-based company that's using big data for wellness applications. So they collect genomic information from individuals, proteomic information from individuals, behavioral information, environmental, health information, medical records, microbiomes, metabolomes. And so when they collect that data, clearly that data is very sensitive to an individual. We're going past patient healthcare records all the way into their genomic information. They use that data, they combine that data, and then they actually offer personalized medicine to individuals on the basis of their molecular makeup. This is an active program that's going on right now in BC. Now, how do we do that and actually sort of protect the privacy and the rights of individuals? There are two key concepts that allow us to do this on a bedrock of privacy by design. The first one is the notion of metadata. The idea here is that for every single individual piece of information, we will surround that information with data that describes its existence. Where did it come from? Where is it going to? What is retention policy? What version is it? Who's allowed to see it? Where is it physically allowed to reside? What is its security clearance? What is retention policy? Et cetera, et cetera. This metadata surrounds this raw data a bit like a piece of chocolate around a Malteser. So this metadata is the only way to access this core piece of information. In addition to that, moving on to the next slide, we look at who is asking for this information. This could be a clinical researcher, it could be a clinician or a researcher or a medical professional, a nurse, it could be a member of the public. Who's asking for that information? We use something called attribute-based access controls, which means that we look at the attributes of the people asking for the information. Who are they? What role are they in? Where are they physically? What Wi-Fi network are they on? What's the MAC address? What device are they coming from? What time of day is it? And we look at those. And then what happens is we implement essentially a firewall on every single piece of information individually. So we take the user information, who's looking for this information, take the metadata information, and apply rules. Is this person in fact allowed to see this information? And those rules will include compliance, consent, freedom of information before that data is in fact released. And to be able to do that on billions of assets, which is what big data allows us to do, means that we can secure every piece of information irrespective of where people are coming from or what network they're on, etc. So the last thing we can do here as well is, depending on who you are, what are the attributes of the people accessing the information, information can be modified to actually suit the use it's being used for. So for example, this is actually a cholesterol example where we hold a whole lot of information about somebody's cholesterol. A clinician could come in and say, I need the patient record, the person's come to ER, I just need all the patient information. I'm allowed to see it, so give me the information, and the information is presented. A researcher, on the other hand, may not be allowed to see all that information. We may have to de-identify information or pseudo-identify information, and so that would be done as part of the rule before information is released. A statistician, on the other hand, may not be interested in individual information, may be interested in a population of information, and so that attribute comes in and we give them statistics information, not raw data. And the last one could be the patient themselves, for a patient portal, for example, who gets to see their information, their lab test results across all of their data. Moving on. So the benefits of zero trust data is this notion that we can take privacy and security, we can embed it into the information layer, which is very important in these days of cloud computing, of private clouds, of information being held outside the physical nature of a hospital, for example. We can defend the information at the data layer. We can implement privacy by design at the data layer. We can maintain confidentiality and privacy. We can modify rules if we choose to, or the data governance, data steward can modify rules to control what data goes anywhere. It scales to very large sizes because essentially it's based on industry standard big data mechanisms. And that concludes kind of a quick run through the practicalities of taking a technology like big data, installing it into, in this case, healthcare, which is probably the most difficult industry sector we can, and securing the privacy of information for individuals whilst allowing the control necessary to Anne's point, I think on slide number 3, privacy is about control. Who can see what, when, and how? It's about context. Am I allowed this information for this particular purpose? And we can now do that in a big data environment. So I'll pause there for questions. Back over to Tom, I think.
Yes, thank you both, Dr. Terry and Dr. Cavoukian, for that very informative presentation. We do have some time for a few questions. So I'll begin with one from the audience. Does zero trust data help address some of the concerns raised by Anne about wearable devices? And Dr. Terry, why don't you start, but I'll give you both a chance to take a crack at that.
Yes, so there's another question that came up about identity. So attribute-based access control means that you can take the identity of somebody asking for information and you can look at the information itself and you can decide whether that information is released to that individual or that machine for that matter. The world of Internet of Things means that we also have machines consuming data as well as individuals. And so is this machine allowed to see this information? An example in healthcare, for example, would be pacemakers. Is this machine or this automatic program allowed to take all of my data from my pacemaker to predict whether I'm going to have a heart attack in 2 weeks' time or not? So these are things that we want to allow to happen, releasing information selectively to, for example, a program that will inform a physician, assuming that that's allowable from the governance mechanism.
And Anne, would you like to weigh in on whether it addresses some of your concerns?
Of course. I love the notion of zero trust. And as Dr. Terry outlined, the specific instances of it in this case, zero trust implies that we are going to reject any notion that you should have access to this data by virtue of who you are or what you do. It's like a trust me model. It's the exact opposite of that. You have to build that trust. There are means by which to do that, and I'm not going to go into it in great length, but this is the exact approach that you need to take for privacy by design, which is embedding the necessary privacy protective measures into the design and doing it in a way where you start from a position, a base of there's no trust here. You have to demonstrate to us on what basis you need this data and how you intend to protect it, and that's how we'll work for you. Thank you.
And that's a great segue, and to a follow-up question coming from our audience. Does HR, human resources, play a role in defining user attributes? Meaning, do job roles and descriptions have to be redefined for an organization when you talk about this zero trust? How does that all work?
The role of HR is interesting, and it has been, I think, changing over time in terms of the trust me model no longer can prevail. In the past, perhaps it did. But now, HR will also have to demonstrate why they need access to certain data. I mean, some things are obvious. When you're a new employee and you're hired, obviously they need information relating to your home address so they can mail you checks. There are a bunch of obvious things that HR needs, and you would be fully aware and fully compliant of it, being a new employee, for example. But past the obvious, to get additional information relating to various attributes and things, especially if it encroaches into the area of health information, that's where the walls go up and the zero trust model kicks in. And that's where your HR's need for the information has to be demonstrated convincingly, and on that basis, you will be given a select amount of information based on a need-to-know basis. So I think it works very well in that model.
Yeah, let me follow up with an example.
Sure.
So, for example, we once did a clinical application on an iPad to work in a heart clinic, and so what we did was say, okay, HR, or actually the nurse coordinator in this case, said, oh, this new nurse is here for a day. She was entered into the LDAP database for the day. And because she was entered in there, part of the LDAP database formed the identity of people who were working in that clinic for that particular day. And so come 9 o'clock, the attribute-based access control said, Well, you're actually part of the team for the day. It's now 9 o'clock. You're working in the clinic. You have access now to patient information to do your job. Come 5 o'clock, when that nurse locum goes off shift, it's now 5 o'clock, and so the provision of information no longer exists. So at 1 minute past 5, she can no longer see that data. And if she throws that iPad or he into the back of the car and drives and it gets stolen, then there's no data breach because the data is not provided outside of that Wi-Fi network outside of those hours. So by combining the context of who can see what, we can completely control who can see what data on that particular day from 9 till 5 without very complex identity systems, just using their standard identity systems.
So it sounds like HR's role is changing in multiple ways vis-a-vis zero trust models. For one, it plays a different role in determining who gets trust and job descriptions, and also it's changing in the way that HR itself earns trust. Would you say that that's fair, Paul?
And there's also a data steward. There is somebody who decides what the rules are. We all have them, the government has them, saying, well, yes, this person is allowed to see this data under this context, under this way. Zero Trust allows that to happen. So, for example, in research, we have ethics committees who decide who can see what data, when, and how. We have governance in the hospital that says what departments and what people can see what data under what mechanism. I should mention that once we set the rules, then a Zero Trust model enforces the rules, but then provides an audit log of what rules were actually created and how they were enforced. Because a big part of doing this is to make sure that people are following the rules so that you can quickly decide whether, oh, this department got it, that department didn't, and is that actually valid or not? Or this person saw this data, and were they actually allowed to do that? That's part of an audit log that goes on. And so having this governance mechanism to allow you to do what I call adult supervision of information is actually pretty critical.
And I couldn't agree more with Paul on that point. We're way past the days where we just accept as a given that information is being used properly and only for the purposes intended. The audit capacity is absolutely critical. Trust but verify. And you would not believe the number of times when you use the audit function, it is not as you expected it to be. So it's a very valuable resource.
So following up on that, Ann, how do you balance between specific provisioning per user with high-quality performance in a data environment?
You know, personally, I avoid the use of the term balance, and I know that may sound odd, because balance invariably implies a trade-off. You can have more of one interest, always at the detriment of another, like a seesaw, if you will. My goal in these instances is always to deliver high functionality and high privacy. I sometimes talk about big data has to be matched with big privacy. So to the extent that you can employ systems like the kind that PHEMI offers, where you can have an extremely high level, high assurance of privacy protection in terms of protection, personal identifiers, direct and indirect, will be protected. And so the data, the remaining data, will not be linked to identifiable individuals. Once you have that link removed, then you're golden. You can do whatever you want with the data from a research perspective, for example, or data analytics perspective, because the privacy harms are linked to the data being linked to a personal identifier. If you can't make that link to a personally identifiable individual, then do whatever you want with the data. I mean, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but the point is the privacy harms stop at that point. And I've talked to many privacy commissioners over the years. Privacy laws relate to personally identifiable data. Once you remove that link, then you can do so much from a data research analytics perspective. That's why I encourage people always to embrace this.
So I'll ask the same question of you as well, Paul. How do you, and forgive me for using the word balance, but how do you strike a balance, the access versus big data?
I'm not sure the question is referring to the performance of controlling information on an object-by-object basis. We now, in the world of big data, have horizontally scalable, multiple processor data centers where we can use storage and compute to provide the kind of real-time performance that you need to do these things. Gone are the days where we are limited to 2 processors and 10 terabytes. As evidenced by big data in Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, we can scale fairly effectively the compute and storage that we need. When we do that, the number one question I always get is, what stops anybody doing anything? And the answer to that is that when we make these big data systems, we make them with privacy by design embedded. And so when it's embedded, then we can actually give data governance and data stewards the necessary mechanisms to control the data, which is the essence of privacy. I'll just follow up on a question I just saw there, which was, how is this different from role-based access control? Role-based access control, what you will find is in most organizations, there's one close to here, who I won't name, have 3,000 employees, and to control information access, they have 5,000 roles. They have more roles than they do employees. It's because of that the US has declared a standard of attribute-based access control as the new generation, if you wish, replacing role-based access control. So with attribute-based access control, the granularity of control of information is very, very significant. So you can control information delivered on a Wi-Fi address, on a MAC address, by geolocation. In PHEMI, we can even control information by vertical height, believe it or not. So we can control who gets to see what, when, and how, which is the essence. So once we have these controls, then we go some way to doing privacy properly.
And one of our audience members is asking, it's apparent what the value is of zero trust in healthcare, but are you helping other industries as well?
So healthcare industry is the big barrier. This is an industry that is, you don't want privacy breaches, and the cost of having a privacy breach is dramatic. Other industries also have privacy issues. So the world of farming, for example, agriculture, collating data. You don't want data to be lost to competitors. The world of finance, of course. Any industry that has a compliance requirement needs to do privacy by design. And then we have, of course, the social impact, which is I don't want my data from my bank account or from my shopping habits going outside of the proper use of information. And so, yes, the privacy by design of zero trust is applicable to any control of information. And it's this control of information that is the essence of privacy.
So, Anne, I'll give you a chance to weigh in on the virtues of privacy by design in other industries as well as healthcare.
We've worked with a number of different organizations. I can't remember if I had the slide on operationalizing privacy by design. So in that, I had instances where we worked with people, all the major companies, Microsoft, IBM, Intel, HP, Oracle. Oracle, we did 2 papers on privacy and security by design. So the whole point was, how do you introduce this into companies who obviously have business interests, but want to make sure that they can deliver to their customers the privacy protections that are increasingly being demanded. As I said, in the post-Edward Snowden world, public trust is at an all-time low, and we need to get this up. So these companies get the importance of this. One example, Bearing Media, which at that time was a startup, and they just got bought out by audience partners. They introduced a very unique way of doing privacy by design. Companies who wanted to deliver targeted ads to certain socioeconomic levels, certain demographics. Bearing Media has a double-blind data architecture system where they got the message, the ad, if you will, from the company. They were told what segment of the population they wanted it directed to. They took care of that. The company didn't know what individuals were getting what information, and vice versa. So they created this amazing double-blind architecture that was totally privacy protective and yet delivered the right ad to the right demographic in a very successful way. And as I said, they were a startup at the time. They've now been bought up. We're working with another company called NYMI, N-Y-M-I. Take a look at them online. They offer think of a Fitbit, but it has nothing to do with a Fitbit, but think of that bracelet like a Fitbit. What a NYMI band does is it measures your electrocardiogram, your cardiac rhythm that is unique to you, and uses that biometric, which is actually a very unique biometric, to replace passwords and PIN numbers and things of that nature. It syncs with your computer or your mobile device, and it is amazingly secure, highly privacy protective, because they embedded privacy by design into the delivery of this, so that it can only be used for the intended purposes. Those are just two examples. There are many more.
Thanks, and as that brings us to the top of the hour here, before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask the audience to take part in the exit survey that will be popping up on your screen. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Terry and Dr. Cavoukian. Attendees, please know that you'll receive an email in the coming days with a link to the replay of this webinar, which you can view again or share with a colleague. Once again, thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.